Steve, a rescued juvenile bobcat who quickly becomes the boss of the house. With his strong personality and stubborn wild instincts, he's known for waking his humans at 4 a.m. for attention and absolutely refusing to be ignored. But Steve isn't a pet. He's a non-releasable rescue with trust issues and the attitude of a tiny, furious shift supervisor. Then one phone call changes everything. A second bobcat arrives, carrying fierce determination and zero respect for Steve's carefully constructed kingdom. What happens when a deeply opinionated territorial bobcat meets a resilient newcomer who refuses to be intimidated? One exhausted rehabber is about to discover that the wildest transformations don't always happen out in the woods. Sometimes they happen right in your living room. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The morning light came in clean and golden through the tall windows of Shannon Merritt's farmhouse in rural Tennessee, cutting long, warm rectangles across the hardwood floor and catching every mote of dust like a little galaxy suspended in the air. It was the kind of morning that made you feel like the world had been freshly laundered overnight. Crisp, bright, smelling faintly of pine from the tree line out back, and coffee from the pot Shannon had set on a timer the night before. It was 6:15 a.m. Shannon knew this because she had been awake since 4:07 a.m. She knew that precise time because she had looked at her phone when the yowling started. Not howling, not growling, yowling. A long, theatrical, operatic sound that no animal in nature truly needs to make unless it is deeply committed to the performance. It had begun as a low trill from somewhere near the foot of her bed, escalated into a kind of mournful foghorn impression, and reached its climax when approximately 9 pounds of juvenile bobcat landed directly on her sternum. "Steve," Shannon said flatly in the darkness. Steve did not respond. Steve simply sat on her chest, his enormous tufted ears swiveling like satellite dishes, his amber eyes glowing in the dark like 2 small headlights. He was, by every observable measure, extremely pleased with himself. "It is 4 a.m, she informed him. He blinked once, very slowly, in the particular way that cats, domestic or otherwise, have perfected to communicate total indifference to human schedules, human needs, and human sanity. Then he stepped directly onto her face. It had all started 8 months earlier, in a way that Shannon would later describe to her friend Deborah as completely accidental and also entirely inevitable. Shannon Merritt was 46 years old, had spent the better part of 2 decades volunteering with the Ridgeline Wildlife Clinic in Harlan County, and was, by her own reckoning, decent with raccoons, pretty good with foxes, and hopeless around anything that could theoretically eat her. She had fostered songbirds, nursed opossums, bottle-fed fawns, and once spent a harrowing weekend caring for a great horned owl who had looked at her with open contempt for 72 hours before being released. She had never worked with a bobcat. So when Dr. Patricia Holloway called her on a Tuesday in late October and said, "Shannon, I have a situation," Shannon's first instinct was to say yes before she heard the details. That instinct had served her well with raccoons. It was about to complicate her life considerably. The situation was this. A juvenile male bobcat, approximately 8 months old, had been surrendered to the clinic by a private individual who had, somewhat inexplicably, acquired him with the original intention of keeping him as an exotic pet. This was, as Patricia explained patiently over the phone, not only inadvisable but also federally regulated and generally just a terrible idea. The animal had spent the formative months of his life in a too small cage, which meant his behavioral development was compromised in ways that made a return to the wild not just unlikely, but genuinely dangerous. For him. He had no fear of humans. He had no survival skills. He was, in the language of wildlife rehabilitation, non-releasable. He also had a name. The previous owner had, for reasons that no one at the clinic had been able to fully explain, named him Steve. "Steve?" Shannon repeated. "He came with the name," Patricia said. "We've decided to keep it because he already responds to it, and honestly, it suits him." Shannon drove to the clinic the following morning. She was shown to a quiet intake room where Steve was housed in a large enclosure. Far better than what he'd come from, but still clearly a temporary arrangement. He was pressed into the far back corner, a small, tawny shape with a bobbed tail and disproportionately large paws, watching her with those luminous eyes from behind a piece of log furniture that served as a hide. The tufts on his ears, that signature Bobcat feature, made him look perpetually startled and vaguely professorial. Shannon sat down on the floor, not near the enclosure, not trying to approach, just on the floor, against the opposite wall, with her back to the cinder block and her knees pulled up, speaking in a quiet, unhurried voice about nothing in particular. The weather, the drive over, the fact that the coffee at the clinic was, respectfully, not great. Steve watched her from his corner. After about 20 minutes, he moved approximately 4 inches to the left, which put him slightly closer to her without technically acknowledging that he had moved at all. Shannon kept talking. After an hour and a half, Patricia found Shannon still on the floor, mid-sentence about a documentary she'd watched about migratory birds, and Steve sitting about 2 feet from the enclosure wire, no longer pressed into the corner, watching Shannon with an expression that suggested he found her moderately tolerable. "He hasn't done that with anyone," Patricia said softly from the doorway. Shannon looked at Steve. Steve looked at Shannon. His tail, that stubby, expressive little flag, twitched once. "So," Patricia said, "I was wondering if you'd be open to a conversation about placement." Shannon thought about her farmhouse, her mornings, her quiet life, her complete lack of experience with bobcats. "Tell me what he'd need," she said. Getting Steve into her truck took 45 minutes. Getting Steve out of the truck and into the house took another hour and a half. He rode in a large transfer crate, and Shannon had followed all of Patricia's instructions precisely. Covered the crate on 3 sides for security, played soft classical music during the drive. Patricia's suggestion. Shannon personally would have chosen country but was willing to defer to the professional, and pulled slowly into her driveway to avoid any sudden jolts. She had prepared a transition room in her spare bedroom, high shelving installed along all 4 walls, a large elevated platform, multiple hide boxes, a window with a view of the back pasture, and this part had cost her 3 weekends and 2 trips to the hardware store. A custom-built enclosure attached to the side of the house so Steve could safely experience outdoor air and sounds without exposure to predators or the general hazards of unsupervised wilderness. She opened the crate in the transition room, stepped back, and sat on the floor. Steve did not come out. She waited. The sun moved. Shannon ate a granola bar. Steve did not come out. She left the room entirely, cracked the door, and sat in the hallway. After another hour, she heard the very small sound of paws on hardwood. She held absolutely still. Then the sound of paws on carpet. Then silence. Then, from around the edge of the doorframe, one enormous tufted ear appeared, followed by a suspicious amber eye. Shannon looked at the ceiling and pretended to have no awareness whatsoever of what was happening. The ear disappeared. Then it came back. Then the whole head appeared. Then Steve walked calmly into the hallway, looked Shannon directly in the eyes, made a small chirping sound, a noise that was, objectively, extremely cute and slightly undignified for an apex predator, and walked back into the room. Shannon exhaled. "Okay," she said quietly to no one. "We're doing this." Over the following weeks, Steve's personality emerged the way fog lifts off a morning field, gradually, then all at once. He was, Shannon came to understand, deeply opinionated. He had strong feelings about when his enclosure got cleaned, a process he regarded as a personal affront and supervised with hostile energy. About what enrichment items were acceptable. Raw meat-based puzzles? Excellent. Feather wands beneath his dignity, crinkle balls, oddly beloved, and about Shannon's schedule. He had, without any consultation, appointed himself the household's chief timekeeping officer, and he was neither lenient nor reasonable in this role. Bedtime was 9:30 p.m. He would pace and chirp if Shannon stayed up past it. Wake time was 4 a.m., non-negotiable. Mealtime was 7 a.m. and 4 p.m. If Shannon was so much as 5 minutes late on the afternoon feeding, he would position himself in a doorway and stare at her with the focused intensity of a prosecuting attorney. "He's basically a very large, very grumpy shift supervisor," Shannon told Deborah over the phone one evening. "Is he dangerous?" Deborah asked, the way all of Shannon's friends asked. "He's a wild animal," Shannon said carefully. "I never forget that. He's not tame. He just tolerates me. And sometimes I think he might actually like me, though he would never in a million years admit it." He would, in fact, on 3 separate occasions, curl up approximately 6 inches from Shannon's feet while she read in the armchair, which for a non-releasable bobcat with trust issues was essentially the equivalent of a declaration of deep and abiding affection. He had, Shannon admitted to herself one quiet Sunday morning, watching him perch in his window platform with his face tipped into the early sun, become the most interesting relationship of her adult life. She told this to no one except Deborah, who was sworn to secrecy. Steve, for his part, seemed entirely aware of his own importance. He had the bearing of a small medieval lord surveying his domain. He moved through the house, in the carefully managed, supervised way that Patricia had approved, with a kind of regal deliberateness, as though every room he deigned to enter should be grateful for the honor. He was the boss of the house. He knew it. Shannon knew it. Everyone who visited knew it. And then, on a Wednesday afternoon in March, that order was disrupted in a way that no one, especially Steve, had anticipated. Patricia called at 2 in the afternoon, which was significant because Patricia had learned over the past several months that Shannon usually had some downtime between 2 and 4. "I have another situation," Patricia said. Shannon closed her eyes briefly. "Tell me." The situation was a juvenile female bobcat, approximately 6 months old, who had been brought to the clinic after being found on the side of Route 11E following what appeared to be a vehicle strike. She had survived. She was stable, eating, alert. But the injury to her spine had left her with permanent paralysis in her hind legs. She would never walk normally. She would never run. She would, in all likelihood, never be able to survive independently in the wild, even if her paralysis could have been reversed, which it could not. She was dragging herself around her enclosure with pure front limb power, Patricia said, with a determination that had made the entire clinic staff go a little quiet. Someone had named her Willow. "She needs a permanent placement with someone who understands non-releasable bobcats," Patricia said. "Someone with the space, the setup, the experience. Shannon, you're the only person in this county I trust with this." "Patricia," Shannon said carefully, I don't know if Steve... I know. It's a process. I'm not asking you to put them together tomorrow. I'm asking if you'll consider giving her a home. Shannon looked at the window platform, where Steve was sitting in his afternoon patch of sunlight, one paw hanging off the edge with the casual confidence of someone who has never once doubted that the entire world belongs to them. "Let me think about it," Shannon said. She thought about it for approximately 11 minutes. Then she called Patricia back. "I'll come see her Thursday," she said. Willow was not what Shannon had expected, though she realized, driving home on Thursday afternoon, that she hadn't been entirely sure what she'd expected. She had been braced for something fragile, something diminished, an animal whose injury had defined everything about her. What she found instead was a bobcat who had clearly not received the message that she was supposed to be tragic. Willow had dragged herself from one end of her enclosure to the other approximately 4 times during the 40 minutes Shannon spent in the room. She had batted a hanging enrichment toy with extreme violence. She had eaten most of her afternoon meal with aggressive enthusiasm, and she had fixed Shannon with an assessing look that was, in its directness and its total absence of sentimentality, deeply familiar. "She reminds me of Steve," Shannon told Patricia. "I thought she might," Patricia said. The introduction process took weeks, conducted with the kind of careful, incremental patience that wildlife rehabilitation demands, and that pop culture never shows because it is not dramatic enough for television. There were scent swaps first, items from each cat's space placed in the other's environment. There were visual introductions through a secure barrier. There was a period Shannon privately called the era of aggressive pretending not to notice each other, during which both bobcats were technically in the same room, but ostentatiously focused on opposite walls. Steve, to his credit, did not act threatened. He acted something more nuanced than that. Watchful, cautious, curious in the careful way of an animal who has learned that trust is a resource to be allocated with precision. He would approach the barrier and sit at a distance. He would sniff the air when Willow moved. He would, occasionally, make a low sound that Shannon had never heard him make before. Not aggressive, not anxious, something quieter and more uncertain. Willow, for her part, was completely unbothered by Steve's existence. She dragged herself around her side of the introduction space with her usual determined energy and regarded Steve with the expression of someone who has very little time for nonsense but is willing to reserve judgment. The first real shift came on a Tuesday evening in late April. Shannon had set up a supervised shared space session. Both cats in the large interior room, enough space that either could retreat, Shannon present but unobtrusive, reading in the armchair. Willow had dragged herself to the center of the room. Steve was on his elevated platform. And then, over the course of about 20 minutes, Steve descended. Slowly, without drama. He came down from his platform, walked to a spot approximately 3 feet from Willow and sat. He did not look at her. He looked at the window. Willow did not look at him. She looked at the floor. They sat that way for 40 minutes. Shannon, watching over the top of her book with a heart that was doing something it hadn't done in a while, swelling quietly, warmly, in a way that was slightly embarrassing, did not move. That was the beginning. Here is the thing about Steve that Shannon had understood for months, the thing that had made her both love him deeply and respect him carefully. He had a need for control that came directly from his history. A cat who spent his early months in a cage too small for his nature develops a fierce investment in the boundaries of his world. Steve managed everything: Shannon's schedule, his own territory, the rhythm of each day. Because management was safety. It was the only kind of safety he had ever been taught to trust. And then Willow arrived, And Willow did not understand his management system and did not care and could not be intimidated and was not interested in the political structure of the house as Steve had organized it, and dragged herself cheerfully and implacably wherever she wanted to go. And Steve, slowly, over weeks of watching and hovering and not quite touching, began to let go of a little of it. He began sleeping closer to her. 6 feet, then 4. Then, one evening in May, Shannon came into the room and found them pressed together on the lower platform. Willow curled into herself. Steve curled around her like a parenthesis, his chin resting on her back, both of them utterly still. Shannon stood in the doorway for a very long time. She was not crying. She was simply having a strong emotional response to a scientifically interesting interspecies bonding phenomenon. She was absolutely crying. The plot twist, and there was a plot twist, though it arrived less like a thunderclap and more like the punchline of a joke you had been set up for and still didn't see coming. Happened on a Sunday morning in June. Shannon woke up at 4:07 a.m. This was normal. Steve was responsible for this. This had been normal for 8 months. But the 4 a.m. yowling was different. It was higher pitched, more insistent, coming from the direction of the large interior room rather than the foot of Shannon's bed. She lay in the darkness, confused, and then it hit her. Steve was still curled up near her feet. She could feel the small, warm weight of him against her ankles. He hadn't left the room. He hadn't started the yowling. The yowling was coming from Willow. Shannon sat up. Steve lifted his head, looked toward the door, looked back at Shannon, and made a small chirping sound that, in Shannon's evolving understanding of Bobcat communication, translated fairly directly to, "Well, are you going to handle that or what?" She got up, patting down the hall in her socks, and found Willow in the interior room, sitting up in the center of the platform, which was already impressive given her mobility, making the most operatic, theatrical noise Shannon had ever heard from an animal that weighed under 15 pounds. When she saw Shannon, she stopped. She looked at Shannon with enormous amber eyes. She made a small, expectant sound. Her food bowl, Shannon realized, looking across the room, was empty. "Willow," Shannon said, with the flat affect of someone who has had this conversation before. "It is 4 a.m. Willow blinked at her with perfect serenity. From behind Shannon, she heard Steve arrive in the hallway. She turned to find him sitting precisely in the center of the doorframe, watching the scene with what could only be described as deep, vindicated satisfaction. He had, Shannon understood in that moment, been schooled. The tiny paralyzed bobcat who had arrived in her house 2 months ago, who did not understand the existing power structure, who was cheerful and determined and completely unbothered by anyone's authority. Willow had been paying attention. She had watched, she had studied, and she had apparently mastered the 4 a.m. yowl. Steve looked at Shannon as if to say, "See, this is what I have been dealing with." Shannon looked at Steve. Then she looked at Willow, who was still sitting on the platform with the regal expectation of someone who has recently been crowned. "You," Shannon told Willow, "have learned from the worst possible teacher." Steve made a sound that was not quite a chirp and not quite a purr, and sat down on Shannon's foot with the satisfied weight of a deposed king who has, against all odds, found a worthy successor. The farmhouse in Harlan County, Tennessee, was not quiet after that. It was never going to be quiet. Shannon had known that from the beginning, though she hadn't known the full shape of what she was agreeing to that October afternoon when she sat down on the floor of a clinic intake room and started talking about the weather to a suspicious little cat in a corner. It was loud at 4 a.m. It was complicated and demanding and expensive, and required a level of attention and knowledge and careful boundary setting that Shannon researched constantly, talked through with Patricia constantly, and held to with the seriousness it deserved. Wild animals were not pets. They were not tame. Steve still had days when he wanted distance and got it, unquestioned. Willow still had moments when her pain and her limitations were evident and real and required management that was both medical and environmental. None of that was simple. None of it was sentimental. But in the evenings, when the light came through the back windows in long, warm bars of gold, Shannon would find them both on the lower platform, Steve's head on Willow's back, Willow's eyes soft and half-closed. And she would stand quietly in the doorway the way she had learned to stand, taking up no more space than necessary, being nothing more disruptive than a presence. And she would feel something she didn't have a precise word for, something between gratitude and wonder, something that had to do with the particular kind of trust that can exist between a wild thing and a human who has been careful enough, patient enough, humble enough to earn it. Steve had come to her guarded and feral and bossier than anyone she had ever met. Willow had come to her broken in body and unbroken in spirit, and apparently determined to democratize the 4 a.m. alarm system. Neither of them had needed saving exactly. They had needed a place where their wildness was not a problem to be solved, but a truth to be respected. They had needed someone who would sit on the floor and talk about nothing and wait. Shannon had been, it turned out, exactly that kind of person. She hadn't known that about herself before Steve. Now she did. Now she was. The morning light came in clean and golden, falling across the platform in warm rectangles. Two small, tufted shapes breathed slowly in the sunlight. The house was quiet in all the right ways, and Shannon stood in the doorway with her coffee and let herself be exactly where she was, which was exactly where she was supposed to be. From the platform, Steve opened one eye, looked at her, closed it again. In Bobcat, this meant, "You may stay." Shannon stayed.